A judge insults Pam Bondi in open court. Minutes later, she has him in handcuffs. You won't believe what just happened. Pam Bondi stepped into the courtroom, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The room was packed with reporters, legal analysts, and spectators, all eagerly awaiting the high-stakes corruption trial that had been making headlines for weeks. At the center of the controversy was a powerful developer accused of embezzling millions in taxpayer funds, money meant for public infrastructure, but funneled into private luxury projects instead. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and Bondi had come prepared to dismantle every defense his high-priced legal team could throw her way. Seated at the bench was Judge Howard Gates, a man known for his sharp tongue, unpredictable rulings, and a reputation for favoring the wealthy elite. He barely acknowledged Bondi's presence as she approached the plaintiff's table, instead flipping through a file with deliberate slowness. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation, but there was something else, an undercurrent of tension that made Bondi pause for just a moment. She had dealt with difficult judges before, but this was different. There was something unsettling about the way Gates carried himself, as if he already knew the outcome of this case before the first argument had even been presented. Finally, without looking up, Judge Gates spoke, his voice dripping with condescension. "Miss Bondi, I assume you've prepared something of substance today? Or should we skip ahead to the part where you waste my time?" His words cut through the room like a blade, and a few chuckles rippled from the defense table. Bondi remained composed, offering a polite but firm nod. "Your Honor, I believe the evidence will speak for itself. This case involves the misuse of taxpayer dollars, and my job is to ensure the facts are presented accurately." Gates leaned back in his chair, feigning boredom. "Taxpayer dollars, right? Because that's never been the foundation of a frivolous case before." His tone was dismissive, almost mocking, as if the very notion of corruption within his courtroom was beneath him. Bondi's jaw tightened, but she refused to rise to the bait. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I would hardly call felony corruption charges frivolous." For the first time, Gates met her gaze, his expression unreadable. The courtroom had grown silent, every spectator sensing the tension between the two. But before Bondi could continue, Gates cut her off again. "Miss Bondi, spare me the lectures. Just get to the point. I don't have all day to entertain whatever grandstanding you have planned." A murmur spread through the gallery. This was beyond tough questioning. This was personal. Judges were supposed to be impartial, but Gates seemed intent on humiliating Bondi before she even had the chance to argue her case. The defense attorneys sat back in their chairs, smirking, knowing they had an ally on the bench. Bondi took a slow breath, recalibrating. She knew exactly what was happening. Gates was trying to rattle her, to put her on the defensive before she even laid out the first piece of evidence. He wanted control, and he wanted her off balance, but she wasn't about to let that happen. She picked up a folder from the table and flipped it open. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. These financial records clearly demonstrate—" Gates cut her off again, this time with a sigh as he rubbed his temples. "Miss Bondi, do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork, or is this just your way of compensating?" The comment was designed to humiliate, and this time it worked. A few gasps echoed through the room, followed by an uneasy silence. Even some members of the jury shifted uncomfortably. The words hung in the air, meant to diminish her credibility, to belittle her presence. It was a power move, a blatant display of arrogance meant to show Bondi, and everyone else, that he was the one in control. But Pam Bondi had spent her career taking on men who thought they were untouchable. She wasn't about to let one overconfident judge undermine her case. She didn't flinch. She didn't react. Instead, she placed the folder back on the table and clasped her hands together. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "if you prefer to continue making this personal, I'm happy to request a recess while we address any professional concerns you may have." It was subtle, not aggressive, but it was a warning, a clear indication that she wasn't going to play into his games. For the first time, Gates hesitated. His lips curled slightly, a flicker of something in his eyes, annoyance, amusement, or perhaps something darker, but he wasn't done. "Oh, I don't have concerns, Miss Bondi," he said with a smirk. "I just know a weak case when I see one." This time, the reaction wasn't just murmurs. There were audible gasps, whispers exchanged in the gallery. A judge dismissing a case like this, especially one with such substantial evidence, was unheard of. The tension in the room thickened. Reporters scribbled in their notepads, knowing something was off. Pam Bondi could feel the weight of the room shifting. Everyone in the courtroom had picked up on it. This wasn't normal judicial behavior. Judges could be firm, but they weren't supposed to be openly hostile. They weren't supposed to mock prosecutors in front of juries. They weren't supposed to protect defendants before evidence was even presented. That's when she realized the truth. This wasn't just courtroom theatrics. Judge Gates wasn't just being combative for sport. He had something to hide, and what he didn't know was that she had something to reveal. Pam Bondi remained calm, but inside her instincts were screaming. This wasn't just hostility, this was obstruction. Gates wasn't just trying to rattle her, he was trying to bury this case before it even started. Bondi took a steadying breath and reached for another document. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit B into evidence." She turned toward the projection screen where the financial statements were displayed. This document details the financial transactions of the defendant's company, showing a pattern of unapproved fund transfers. Judge Gates scoffed, interrupting her yet again. "Miss Bondi, with all due respect, I hate to interrupt your very thorough presentation, but I think we've seen enough numbers for one day." Bondi glanced at him, then back at the screen. He wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. He was dismissing evidence before it was even reviewed. "Your Honor, these financial records are at the heart of this case," Bondi stated, keeping her tone even. "They clearly demonstrate discrepancies between approved funding and actual expenditures." Gates rolled his eyes. "Right. And yet I fail to see anything that justifies wasting this court's time." There it was again, that phrase, wasting time. Bondi caught the briefest flicker of movement at the defense table. The defendant, Charles Lawson, had barely reacted up until this point. But now, he had shifted ever so slightly in his seat, his eyes flicking to the judge in a way that sent Bondi's instincts into overdrive. He wasn't just confident, he was relieved. Judge Gates wasn't just biased. He was protecting someone. A rustle from behind her caught her attention. The prosecution team was exchanging wary glances, sensing the same thing she was. The jury, too, was growing uneasy. A woman in a navy blazer, one of the jurors, furrowed her brows. She had noticed. Bondi straightened, gripping the edge of the table. "Your Honor, I would like to file a motion." "Denied," Gates said flatly. Bondi blinked. "I haven't even stated the motion yet." "And yet, I can already tell you it's going nowhere," Gates said, leaning forward on his elbows. "Miss Bondi, let's be honest here. This entire case is built on speculation, a little creative accounting, and suddenly you're crying corruption." The defense attorney smirked, saying nothing. He didn't have to. Gates was doing all the work for him. Bondi exhaled slowly. "Your Honor, are you refusing to allow my motion before hearing its contents?" A pause, just a beat too long. Then, finally, "I'm refusing to indulge this circus act any longer," Gates declared. The room had officially shifted. No one, not even the most junior law student in the gallery, could miss what was happening. Judges were supposed to rule, not argue, but Gates was doing everything he could to shut her down. Bondi took a slow breath, locking eyes with him. Then she picked up a different folder. "Very well, Your Honor. Let's proceed with the next piece of evidence." She turned to the screen and clicked to the next slide. A document filled the display, a contract signed between the defendant's company and the city's planning board. This contract outlines the projected expenses for the proposed infrastructure project, Bondi explained, her voice steady. "As you'll see, the approved budget totaled just over $2 million. She placed another sheet down on the table. "However, this is an internal ledger from the defendant's company. It shows the actual funds transferred, nearly double that amount." She placed a third document beside it. "And this," she said, pausing for effect, "is the approval signature authorizing the excess transfer." She let the weight of the moment settle before adding, "Signed by Judge Howard Gates." The courtroom cracked open. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The defense attorney visibly stiffened. The defendant shifted again, but this time his composure faltered. He wasn't relieved anymore. He was terrified. Bondi watched the judge's expression carefully. For the first time since she had stepped into the courtroom, he didn't have a quick comeback. "Your Honor," she said, her voice dangerously calm, "would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant?" Gates finally moved, his fingers pressing together so tightly his knuckles whitened. "That document," he said, his voice lower now, measured, "is inadmissible." Bondi tilted her head slightly. "How so?" "It was obtained improperly," he said, barely containing his anger. Bondi didn't even blink. "Your Honor, this document was subpoenaed by my office." His nostrils flared. "Then it was mishandled. I'm ruling it inadmissible." The courtroom wasn't just tense now. It was watching. The jury, the reporters, the bailiff. Every single person in that room was witnessing what was unfolding. Bondi crossed her arms. "Your Honor, you do realize this is a public hearing, correct? That the media is here? That every single person in this room just saw you declare critical financial evidence inadmissible without a reason?" A muscle in his jaw twitched. "That's enough, Miss Bondi," he said, his voice a little too sharp, a little too panicked. She didn't move, didn't blink. Then, with practiced ease, she reached into her case and pulled out a small recorder. She placed it on the table and pressed play. A voice filled the courtroom, low, gruff, unmistakable. "Take care of it. I don't care how." A crackle. Then, "Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers." Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Judge Gates didn't move, didn't breathe. Bondi didn't look at him. She didn't need to, because now every single person in that courtroom had heard him, and the real game was about to begin. The courtroom remained frozen. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning, barely audible over the weight of the revelation that had just echoed through the room. Pam Bondi let the silence stretch. She knew better than to rush this moment. It was one thing to suspect corruption. It was another thing entirely to hear it. The unmistakable voice of Judge Howard Gates, caught on tape, issuing an order to bury evidence. Across the room, the jury exchanged glances. Some sat rigid, their jaws clenched, while others looked outright appalled. The defense team had gone completely still, their confident smirks erased. Even Charles Lawson, the defendant who had walked into this courtroom believing the system would protect him, was visibly sweating. But the person who had changed the most was Judge Gates himself. For the first time since the hearing began, his carefully composed mask was cracking. His usual smugness was gone. His breathing had become shallow. His hands, usually so steady, curled into fists on the bench. Bondi turned to face him directly, her voice steady and controlled. "Would you care to explain that, Your Honor?" Gates's mouth opened, but no words came out. He swallowed, his throat bobbing, as he scrambled for something, anything to say. Then, finally, This recording is inadmissible." His voice was rough, forced. Bondi didn't even blink. "You seem awfully concerned about what is and isn't admissible, Your Honor." She let that hang in the air before adding, "Almost as if you have something to hide." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Gates straightened, his face tightening. "This is outrageous." He slammed a hand against his desk, the sound echoing through the chamber. "This entire hearing is descending into chaos because of your grandstanding." Bondi tilted her head slightly. "Chaos?" she echoed, her voice light, almost amused. "I'd say this is clarity." She glanced around the room, at the jury, at the stenographer, at the officers lining the back wall. "Finally, we have some transparency in this courtroom." The tension hitched up another notch. Gates was panicking, and everyone knew it. The judge tried to regain control, his voice rising in desperation. "This hearing is over. I am terminating this proceeding immediately." Bondi arched an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" Gates hesitated. He was cornered. Everyone in the room could see it. He exhaled sharply. "This is not how the law works," he snapped. This is an ambush. This is a witch hunt." Bondi took a step forward, her heels clicking against the polished wood floor. "No, Your Honor," she said, her tone unwavering. "This is called accountability." A thick silence fell over the room. Then, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Every head turned as two uniformed officers stepped inside, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a stern-looking officer with a neatly pressed uniform, cleared his throat before speaking. "Judge Howard Gates," he announced, his voice firm, carrying through the chamber. "You are under arrest." The reaction was immediate. Gasps, murmurs, reporters scrambling for their phones, camera shutters clicking wildly. The jury exchanged stunned glances. The defendant looked utterly petrified. But the most dramatic reaction came from Judge Gates himself. His face drained of color. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His fingers dug into the desk as if trying to anchor himself to the very position of power he had just lost. The lead officer stepped forward. "You have the right to remain silent." "You can't do this," Gates barked, his voice cracking. "I am the law in this courtroom." Pam Bondi folded her arms. "Not anymore." The officers flanked the judge on either side, one reaching into his belt, the other pulling a pair of gleaming silver handcuffs from his pocket. "This is a disgrace. This is political persecution," Gates shouted, his voice rising in pitch as they pulled him to his feet. "I demand to speak to the state bar, to the governor." Bondi watched him struggle, his arrogance now reduced to nothing more than desperate flailing. "You'll have your chance," she said coolly, "during your arraignment." The courtroom was now buzzing with energy. Spectators whispered furiously, reporters were already composing their headlines, and then, just as Gates was about to be led out, the defense attorney, Charles Lawson's lawyer, suddenly stood up. "Wait!" Everyone turned. The defendant, Charles Lawson, had risen to his feet. His hands trembled as he adjusted his tie. He glanced between Bondi, Gates, and the officers. His expression was shifting from panic to calculation. He was figuring out his next move. There's no need for this kind of public spectacle," Lawson said, his voice carefully measured. "Let's be reasonable." Bondi narrowed her eyes. She knew exactly what was happening. He was scared. Lawson was powerful, but his safety net had just been ripped away in real time. Gates was the judge who had protected him, and now that protection was gone. She took a step closer to him, keeping her voice low but firm. "You seem nervous." Mr. Lawson forced a laugh. "Nervous? No, I just think that maybe you should start talking," Bondi interrupted. Silence. Lawson's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Pam let the tension stretch for a moment longer before delivering the final blow. "If you have something to say, now would be the time," she said, "because I promise you, this is only the beginning." The courtroom was no longer just a place of law, it was a battlefield. And the people who had thought they were untouchable were finally realizing their time was up. The courtroom had transformed. It was no longer a place of controlled legal proceedings, but the epicenter of a scandal unraveling in real time. Judge Howard Gates, once the most powerful figure in the room, was now standing in handcuffs, his face red with anger and humiliation. His protests had turned from defiant shouts to desperate mutterings. The officers on either side of him stood firm, their grip tightening as he struggled against the inevitable. But Pam Bondi's attention was no longer on Gates. She was watching Charles Lawson, the wealthy developer who had walked into this courtroom expecting another easy win, the man whose deep political ties had shielded him for years, now stood pale and visibly shaken. His expensive suit no longer looked so crisp. His usual smug arrogance had vanished, replaced by something Bondi recognized instantly: fear. The silence in the room was deafening. Every single person present, jurors, reporters, court staff, held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Lawson licked his lips, his eyes darting between Bondi and the judge in cuffs. His fingers twitched at his sides, his mind racing for an escape. But he had just witnessed firsthand what happened when someone thought they were too powerful to be held accountable. Bondi took a slow step toward him. "Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of authority, "would you like to continue with today's proceedings, or—" she let the word linger, watching him flinch. "Would you prefer to discuss a plea?" A visible shudder ran through Lawson's body. The gallery murmured in hushed whispers. "A plea?" he scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction. He was stalling, trying to maintain the illusion of control. "This whole thing is absurd. Just because one corrupt judge was caught doesn't mean I—" Bondi cut him off, her tone turning sharp. "Doesn't mean what, Mr. Lawson?" She took another step forward. "That you were innocent? That you had no part in this?" She gestured toward Gates, still standing in handcuffs. "The man who just got escorted out of his own courtroom was your insurance policy, wasn't he?" The tension in the room skyrocketed. Lawson's lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering urgently in his ear. But Lawson wasn't hearing him anymore. His mind was spinning, the walls closing in around him. You think one bad judge